Hi there, I'm Sam, and I'm currently rebuilding my Ford Transit camper. In this video, I'm going to show you how to build a lightweight slat ceiling. I'm going to build this ceiling with pine boards and a black canvas backing. In the past, I've used tongue and groove boards when I wanted to do a wood-paneled ceiling, but this time I want to do slats that are each set apart with a little gap between them, which I think has some advantages beyond just giving it a different aesthetic. With tongue and groove boards, each one fits right into the one next to it, which means that you can't just pull out a couple boards in the center if you ever need to do some work up in the ceiling in the future. The other advantage of having boards with a gap between each one is that you eliminate any possible issues that happen just from the movement and flex that happens as a van drives down the road. Then there's no chance of any squeaking, paint cracking at the seams, or just extra expansion and contraction at the connection between each of those boards. Going with this approach, you do need to put up a backing material across the whole ceiling so that it looks nice. You could use thin plywood boards for this, or fabric. Plywood, even if it's thin, is still adding some extra weight, so I'm going to try using this black canvas for this and see how it works. The canvas should be durable enough and hold up well for this application. So with any part of a van conversion, it's worthwhile to prioritize saving weight, but I think this is especially important when you're talking about the higher up areas in the van. The lower you can keep that overall center of gravity, the more stable the vehicle is going to be while driving. So you don't want to add an unnecessarily heavy ceiling up top. For my ceiling, I'm going to use boards that are a 1/4 inch thick. And now there's not many options for buying wood that's this thin, so I'll show you what I did. I bought Select Pine 1x4s, which are 3/4 inch thick. The Select Pine is a little nicer and doesn't have knots in the wood. I then set up the table saw to cut the boards in half. I used a piece of scrap to get the fence on my table saw set up so I'd cut as close to center as possible. I set the blade to a little over half of the width of the board and made the cut in 2 passes. I repeated this for my whole stack of boards. I bought 12 8-foot 1x4s, which should be plenty for the ceiling, which is about 11 foot long, and give me some extras for using as accents in other parts of the van. After cutting the boards on the table saw, there's usually a little bit of a lip or unevenness between the 2 halves of the cut. To clean this up and get all the boards to a uniform thickness, I'll run them through the planer. Each board got a few light passes through the planer, and they all ended up about a 1/4 inch thick. So that was what I did to prepare my wood slats. Now let's take a look at the ceiling framing and the other pieces I have in place before we build the ceiling. Before being ready to put up the canvas and ceiling slats, I already have the roof vent and air conditioner in place. I have all my framing in place, which I'll go over in more detail, and I have my wiring in place. The main ceiling framing is 1/2 inch plywood that's bolted to the ceiling ribs using plus nuts. Additionally, these already have an access hole with another plus nut that I can use for bolting in upper cabinets later. Putting these furring strips over the ceiling ribs is pretty straightforward. The only thing I'll note is that I did cut kerfs into the boards to make it easier to bend them to the curve of the ceiling. Depending on the type of plywood you're using and how flexible or not flexible it is, you may or may not need to cut the kerfs in them. Now the parts where it gets trickier to add support in the ceiling is at the frontmost and the rearmost areas. The front is especially tricky because of how much it curves down in transits. In the front up here by the headliner, I bolted on another furring strip, and I did this earlier when I had the headliner removed so that I could insulate and sound deaden behind it. This board had to have cutouts in it where the clips for the headliner attach. It's a little hard to see because I can't pull the headliner back down since I've reattached it, but the other spot where I have bolts to secure it with is right here and right here. And again, I put plus nuts into the ribs and then bolted the wood on. About midway between this and the frontmost ceiling rib, I added another support that is basically integrated with the wall framing. Since the curve at the front of the Transit is so steep, I wanted my slats to have one more point of support, and this will also help securing the ends of the boards where I have to work around the foam blobs at the front corners. I matched the curve of this support to the curve of the other ceiling supports, so it's all consistent the full way down. Coming to the back of the van here, I also created an additional support that bolts into the top of the rear column here. Without this support here, the very ends of the slats couldn't be secured down, which would probably be fine for the long pieces since they can screw in at multiple places in front. But It'd be a little tricky for the pieces that go right behind the AC, which are just short and would benefit from some extra support right here at the back. I also had to work this one around the wiring harness, so I added some extra blocking, just small chunks of 3/4 inch plywood at the locations where it bolts on, so there was room for the wiring harness to run behind this board. In transits, the vehicle wiring harness is fairly bulky and runs entirely outside of the wall, which is another hurdle that you kind of have to build around when you're doing your framing in transits. The wiring is the other thing that needs to be all in place before doing the ceiling. Right in the center here is where much of the wiring passes from one side of the van to the other. The wires that need to go to the outside, which are for the solar panels and the cell signal booster antenna, also pass through right here and then go out a hole in the roof through a cable entry gland. And then I also have the wires up for anything that's in the ceiling that needs power. So these ones are for the lights. I have a wire here that'll connect the roof vent to, and so on. I also ran a piece of string that goes from this side up through my wiring holes, across, and down the other that I can use if I did forget a wire that I need to run, so I can tie it to that string and pull it through later on. Just a small thing that'll be a big help if I do need to fish a wire across the ceiling later. So with all that in place, let's start to prepare these slats to actually put them up on the ceiling. I don't want to do more sanding and finishing of these boards than I have to, so rather than pre-finish them after milling them all to 1/4 inch, I measured and mapped out the lengths I need to cut each piece. I made a pattern where the joints are all staggered and align over the furring strips. These exact measurements aren't going to be universal since the position of the fan and air conditioner could be different, but I just wanted to show how I mapped it out. I then began to sort through all my pieces and cut them to their appropriate lengths. As I cut them, I laid them out in order on the floor until I had all of the pieces for the full pattern. There are less on the left side because there will be a full-length upper cabinet along that side of the van's ceiling, so I'm not going to put slats there. After this, I began the slow process of sanding each board. For each one, I picked which side would be the front and marked the back side so I didn't have to waste time sanding the backs. For the wood finish, I chose polyurethane. I tinted the polyurethane I used for the first coat to give the boards a little bit of extra warmth. Then I just worked my way through all the boards. I finished putting a second coat of polyurethane on all those boards a little bit ago, and so now I'm going to work on putting up the canvas backing in here. Sanding and finishing all those boards took a lot of time actually, but that's just the way that part always goes. To attach the canvas, I'm going to use some 3/8 inch staples, and I have a pneumatic staple gun that I'll use for this, but one of the hand kind of spring-loaded ones would work as well. When thinking through attaching the planks after I have the canvas up, one thing I thought was I need a way to figure out where the exact center of the ceiling is, and that'll be harder to do once the canvas is up. So what I'm going to do is I already measured and I put a mark that's exactly in the center of these boards. And I'm going to put a screw in a couple of them that I can use as a reference point once the canvas is up. This location of the screw is going to be like right under the center of a plank, so I'll go ahead and cut a little hole in the canvas so that can pop through, and then I'll be able to use that as an alignment point, which I'll show later once I start putting up the planks. With those screws added to mark my centers, I could start stapling the canvas up. First, I held it in place temporarily with some extendable helping hands. I find these quite handy for ceiling work, but if you don't have any, you could also use some spring clamps. Now I could start securing it with staples. I started close to the wall, leaving an inch or two of fabric that can tuck behind the wall panel. I pulled the canvas taut and added a staple near the wall on each furring strip. Next, I worked all the way across one of the furring strips. I added about 4 staples total along the strip. I figured that by adding fewer staples, there'd be less chance of a staple ending up somewhere where it isn't covered by a board. I cut a little slot in the fabric where needed for those center screws to pop through. I worked my way through, moving toward the front. I tried to keep an even tension on the canvas. Once all the planks are up, very little of the canvas actually shows, so it's okay if it's not hung perfectly. The canvas is 5 foot wide and is sold by the yard, so you can get any length you need. With it being 5 foot wide, it's not quite wide enough to go all the way across a transit ceiling. I didn't worry about it extending all the way on the driver's side, as there'll be an upper cabinet the full length of this side, so I can just go a little past where the cabinet will start. If you need to cover the full length, you'd have to do it with 2 pieces, and you could hide the seam under one of the wood slats. Once the canvas was fully up, I cut out openings for the fan and roof vent. I cut these a little undersized here, but later cut them a bit wider. Next, I got a board ready to use as my center reference board. I used an extra board for this and not one of my actual ceiling pieces. I marked the location of each center screw on the board, then found the center of the board at those locations and drilled a hole. The hole needs to be big enough for the alignment screw to fit through. The holes I drilled here were too small and I had to go back with a wider drill bit. Back in the van, I placed the board over the alignment screws and then used some small pin nails to hold it in place, later adding some staples as well. This board is just going up temporarily so I can align the others off of it, and then I'll pull it down later. Next, I trimmed off the excess fabric at the front and back. At the front, I left just a couple inches that could be tucked in behind the headliner. At this point, when messing with the canvas, I also decided to change up my strategy for working the ceiling around the foam blobs in the front corners. Rather than leaving them fully in place and cutting the planks to fit around them, I decided I would run the planks under them and cut the foam blobs shorter to fit, which I'll show later. This meant I needed to add some additional blocking to the ceiling rib here. In hindsight, I would have just mounted the furring strip that I mounted under the headliner all the way to each end here instead of screwing on these separate blocks. Here I just opted to attach them by pre-drilling holes and using screws rather than messing with plus nuts. By this point, the finish on my ceiling planks had had enough time to dry and I was ready to start installing them. I put the first plank up and used some 1/4 inch thick scraps of wood to space it away from my center alignment board. I held the plank in place using these extendable helping hands. If working alone, I find them to be super valuable, but if you have a second person to help hold the boards up, you could get by without them. I'll put a link to them and the other tools and materials for this project in the description below. Besides the alignment screw I have in the center, I also added a screw in the center of each of my furring strips further off to the side. This allowed me to hold up a yardstick touching both screws so that I could pre-drill my holes in the center of each plank and all the holes would align. Using the measurement markings on the yardstick also made it easy to measure that I was drilling my pilot hole for the screws in the center of the plank. I put up the front piece the same way, using my 1/4 inch pieces to align the board off my center plank. The next row needs a cutout for the fan, but is also the row where the lights will be. I marked the location of each light using a piece of tape, and then I marked the center and used a hole saw to cut a hole for my puck lights. Next, I cut the needed cutouts for the boards that fit around the fan opening, as well as the air conditioner. I used a combination of a bandsaw and a handsaw for this. A jigsaw could also work, but I didn't use it because I didn't want to take a chance of the bottom of the jigsaw scratching the wood since it was pre-finished. Before installing this row, I cut small openings in the canvas right where the holes for the lights were and pulled the wires down from the ceiling. Then I screwed the plank in place. After this, I did the row on the other side of the centerpiece. Once that row was done, I could pry off my alignment board as it was no longer needed. Now I just worked my way across the ceiling, putting up one plank after the other. For each screw, I pre-drilled with a countersink bit so all the screw heads would sit flush. I'm using number 8 3/4 inch brass screws because brass matched the wood well. The brass screws are more prone to breaking than steel screws though, so I made sure the pilot hole was pre-drilled the full depth and I tightened the last few turns by hand with a screwdriver. After all the planks were up, I wired in my puck lights. I always like it once the ceiling is up and the lights are in because then I can use the ceiling lights hooked up to a temporary power supply whenever I need some extra work light inside the van. At this point, I was really liking how the ceiling was coming out. Zooming in though, there are a few things that need addressing. Due to how steep the front roof curve is, the 3 shorter planks in the center leading to the fan don't sit even with the longer planks to their sides. The issue is particularly noticeable once the fan trimming is added. To fix this, I cut a strip of 3/4 inch plywood about 1 inch wide that I'll add as a support to tie these all together and even them out. I worked it into place above the canvas at the edge of these boards. Then I added screws. Once the support was screwed into the outer 2 boards, the middle 3 were pulled down so that everything was even, and the trim ring could sit flush with all the planks. I accidentally put the two outer screws too far outward, and they weren't fully covered by the trim ring, so I had to move the screws and patch the holes, which is the next thing I needed to address anyways. Along this back section, I messed up in a couple spots and accidentally put a screw in the center rather than offset to align with the others. I have a clever way to fix this though. Here's a spot I already tested my fix, and from afar it blends in pretty well, but if you get closer you can still see it. To fix these spots, I'll use some scraps from the ceiling and the special plug cutting drill bit to cut a plug that I can use as a patch. I marked the spots on my board with grain similar to the areas I needed to repair, and then I cut plugs from the areas. This one is a 3/8 inch plug cutter, and here's what a chunk looks like after it's cut. The edges had a small burr that I gently smoothed out with some fine grit sandpaper. On the ceiling itself, I needed to widen the hole, so I used a 3/8 inch Forstner bit. I started the hole by first using another hole as a guide so the bit wouldn't jump around. Then I drilled it the rest of the way. I added a small bit of wood glue and then pushed the plug in. I accidentally pushed this one too far, but I was able to unscrew the plank and push it back out so that it sat flush with the surface. I then smoothed it out with a little sandpaper and a small touch-up of finish. I repeated this for the others. Both the fan and air conditioner have trim rings that install with screws around their edges. The last thing I need to address is the foam blobs at the front corners, which I need to trim shorter until they fit under the new ceiling. I already cut the first one, but I'll show you how I did it on the other one. There isn't a great way to figure out how much to cut and at what angles, so I did it mostly by trial and error, just cutting a little more and a little more until it fit. Using my first one as a reference, I made a mark about 5.5 inches up from this recessed area in the blob here. Down on this edge, the cut angles back fairly steeply to match the angle of the last board along the curved ceiling. Across the front, I made a straight line that leads up to follow this front edge. To cut the foam, I used a Japanese pole saw. This cut the foam fine, and I wasn't concerned if the edges were a little rough, as I'm going to be covering this foam in upholstery fabric later. The cut along the front needs to be angled back to match the angle over at the side, again due to the curve in the ceiling. Additionally, I sliced off more of the back, otherwise this section was getting in the way. After a test fit, I found another area that needed more foam trimmed off. Once it was all cut, it fit like this. I secured it in place with the original plastic clips that I had pried out to remove it. And that was basically it for this ceiling build. I thought the canvas backing worked out really well, and besides being lighter, it was also easier to install than a plywood backing, which would need to be cut to fit and painted. All that to say, I would use it again. Let's check out a few more of these beauty shots because I really like how it came out, and then we'll close out by doing a quick calculation of how much this ceiling weighs. So to figure out the weight of my ceiling, I cut a 12-inch section of my ceiling plank material and I weighed that on the scale. That came out to 3.3 ounces, which I said, geez, that's pretty light. So then I cut a second piece to double check, and that one came out to 3 ounces. So we'll go with the 3.3 for the calculations. Then I calculated the total number of feet that I put up of this in the van, and I added an extra row worth of material in because I may end up putting a partial row along the front, in front of that cabinet, and along the wall on the other side just to fill in any gap when I'm trimming things out later. Anyway, the total length I calculated with that was 133.5 feet. So if we multiply those two things together, 3.3 ounces and 133.5 feet, that gave me a total of 440.55 ounces, which is about 27.5 pounds. Then add in about 4 pounds, which is the weight of 4 yards of the 10-ounce canvas that I used, and that's 31.5 pounds, which is really lightweight. There's some screws in there too, so with that, let's round up to 32 pounds. But I can't complain about that at all. That's lightweight, and it's a really good-looking ceiling, so I'm really happy with that. That wraps it up for this one. Thanks for supporting this channel by watching these videos. I'll see you in the next one.